On May 1, 1960, Captain Francis Gary Powers lifted off from Peshawar Air Station in Pakistan at 6:20 hours local time, climbing into the pre-dawn darkness aboard Lockheed U-2 Article 360. The mission, designated Operation Grand Slam, tasked Powers with photographing Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile facilities at Plesetsk, submarine construction yards at Severodvinsk, and military installations across the Ural Mountains before landing at Bodo Air Station in Norway. The flight plan traced a route covering approximately 3,800 miles through the heart of Soviet airspace at altitudes exceeding 70,000 feet, heights that Central Intelligence Agency planners calculated placed the aircraft beyond the reach of Soviet air defense systems. Powers had flown similar missions before, penetrating Soviet territory with confidence born from 4 years of U-2 operations, during which not a single aircraft had been lost to hostile action. The presumption that altitude provided absolute sanctuary reflected technical assessments, concluding that Soviet surface-to-air missiles could not intercept targets above 65,000 feet, and that MiG interceptors lacked the performance to climb to operational U-2 altitudes. That confidence shattered at 8:53 hours Moscow time, when an SA-2 Guideline missile detonated near Powers' aircraft at 70,500 feet, sending the spy plane tumbling toward Earth in a catastrophic failure that would trigger one of the most damaging intelligence disasters of the Cold War. The strategic rationale justifying U-2 overflights of Soviet territory emerged from desperate intelligence requirements that conventional collection methods could not satisfy. Throughout the 1950s, American strategic planners confronted fundamental uncertainty regarding Soviet military capabilities. Nikita Khrushchev boasted publicly about Soviet missile production, claiming the USSR manufactured ballistic missiles like sausages and possessed sufficient nuclear strike capability to devastate the United States in any conflict. American intelligence agencies struggled to determine whether these claims represented genuine capabilities or propaganda designed to intimidate Western powers. The missile gap debate dominated American defense policy discussions, with some analysts warning that the Soviet Union had achieved decisive strategic superiority, while others argued that intelligence data remained too fragmentary to support definitive conclusions. Ground-based intelligence collection inside the closed Soviet society provided fragmentary information insufficient for comprehensive threat assessment. Signals intelligence offered insights into Soviet communications, but could not reveal physical locations of missile bases, bomber deployments, or nuclear weapons facilities. Photographic reconnaissance from aircraft operating along Soviet borders captured only peripheral areas, leaving the vast interior unmapped and strategic facilities hidden from observation. President Dwight Eisenhower, former Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe during World War II, understood intelligence value from extensive military experience. He recognized that decisions about American strategic forces, defense budgets, and arms control negotiations required accurate assessments of Soviet capabilities rather than speculation driven by worst-case assumptions. Eisenhower authorized development of specialized high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft in November 1954 after scientists and intelligence officials presented proposals for overhead collection systems that might penetrate Soviet airspace with acceptable risk. The Land Committee, led by Harvard chemist Edwin Land, who had pioneered instant photography, examined technical feasibility of various reconnaissance platforms. The committee concluded that existing technology could produce an aircraft capable of flying above 70,000 feet, altitudes that intelligence assessments indicated exceeded Soviet interceptor and missile capabilities. The committee recommended immediate development with highest national priority. Lockheed's Skunk Works division, led by legendary designer Clarence Kelly Johnson, won the contract to develop what became designated the U-2 in December 1954. Johnson's team had previously designed the P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, and the F-104 Starfighter that achieved speed and altitude records through radical design optimization. Johnson applied similar philosophy to the reconnaissance aircraft, engineering a platform optimized entirely for altitude performance while sacrificing conventional capabilities. The U-2 employed a glider-like wing spanning 103 feet with aspect ratio exceeding 14:1, mated to a lightweight fuselage housing a single Pratt & Whitney J57 P-37 turbojet engine producing 11,200 pounds thrust. The wings were so long and flexible that tips deflected upward by 6 feet during flight, and wingtip skids protected the structure during landing when the wings bent downward as fuel weight decreased. The design achieved remarkable efficiency. Fuel capacity of 1,335 gallons enabled range exceeding 4,000 miles, despite the aircraft weighing only 17,000 pounds fully loaded. The airframe was constructed primarily of aluminum, with some titanium components in high-temperature areas near the engine. Landing gear configuration featured tandem main wheels housed in the fuselage centerline and detachable pogo wheels supporting wingtips during ground operations. The pogos fell away after takeoff, and pilots landed the aircraft on the centerline gear before allowing one wing to drop to the ground, a procedure requiring precise technique and creating substantial pilot workload during approach. The performance characteristics Johnson's team achieved exceeded initial expectations. The prototype completed its first flight on August 1, 1955 at Groom Lake, Nevada, the remote test facility that would become famous as Area 51. Test pilot Tony Levere discovered that the aircraft could reach 65,000 feet within months of initial flight testing. By late 1955, U-2 aircraft routinely operated above 70,000 feet during developmental flights. The operational ceiling depended heavily on aircraft weight, atmospheric conditions, and engine performance, but mission profiles typically planned for cruise altitudes between 68,000 and 72,000 feet. At these heights, the air density was so low that the aircraft operated in what pilots called the coffin corner, the narrow margin between maximum speed limited by aerodynamic heating and compressibility effects, and minimum speed where insufficient lift caused aerodynamic stall. The margin measured only 10 knots indicated airspeed at maximum altitude. Pilots maintained precise speed control through constant attention to airspeed indicators and attitude instruments. Any deviation risked either structural failure from excessive speed or uncontrollable stall from insufficient velocity. The Central Intelligence Agency established the U-2 program under such intense secrecy that even the Air Force initially remained unaware of the project's existence, until Eisenhower decided operational command should transfer to military control. Pilots recruited from Strategic Air Command received cover stories describing experimental weather research missions for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. The initial cadre of pilots underwent training at Groom Lake starting in early 1956, learning to operate at extreme altitudes where conventional flight experience provided limited preparation. The physiological challenges were substantial. Cabin altitude in the U-2 maintained 28,000 feet equivalent even with the pressure suit inflated. Pilots breathed pure oxygen for hours before flight to purge nitrogen from body tissues and reduce decompression sickness risk. The MC-2 full-pressure suit, similar to those worn by X-15 rocket plane pilots, provided protection if cabin pressurization failed. The suit was uncomfortable, restricting movement and creating fatigue during missions lasting 8 hours or longer. Training included celestial navigation techniques because pilots would operate beyond range of conventional navigation aids for extended periods. The U-2 carried a periscopic sextant allowing pilots to take star sights during daylight by viewing stars visible in the darkened sky at extreme altitude. The sextant measurements combined with dead reckoning enabled position determination accurate to within a few miles, adequate for navigation, but requiring skillful technique. Pilots practiced emergency procedures for equipment failures that would prove fatal at maximum altitude. If the pressure suit failed, the pilot had approximately 15 seconds of useful consciousness, before hypoxia rendered him unable to execute emergency descent. If the engine failed, the aircraft became a glider with descent rate requiring immediate decisions about whether attempting to reach friendly territory was feasible or whether ejection over hostile territory was inevitable. The first operational U-2 overflight of Soviet territory occurred on July 4, 1956, deliberately timed for the American Independence Day holiday as a symbolic gesture. CIA pilot Hervé Stockman departed from Wiesbaden, West Germany, and penetrated Soviet airspace to photograph facilities near Leningrad and the Baltic states before landing in Norway. Soviet air defense radar detected the intrusion immediately. The distinctive radar return from an aircraft flying at unprecedented altitude traveling at modest speed created obvious signature that Soviet operators recognized as a reconnaissance mission. Ground controllers directed MiG-19 interceptor aircraft to engage the target. Multiple fighters scrambled from bases near the projected flight path, climbing desperately to reach the intruder. The MiG-19 represented the Soviet Air Force's most modern interceptor in 1956, capable of supersonic speed in level flight, and possessing ceiling performance superior to earlier generation fighters. But the MiG-19's maximum altitude approached only 55,000 feet under optimal conditions. The fighters climbed to their absolute ceiling, hanging on their propellers with insufficient airflow over control surfaces to maintain directional stability, then stalled and fell away as the U-2 cruised 15,000 feet higher. Frustrated Soviet pilots radioed ground controllers reporting they could see the target aircraft, a thin black cross against the blue sky far above, but could not reach it. Soviet air defense forces filed detailed reports acknowledging that unidentified aircraft had violated Soviet airspace at altitudes their interceptor force could not reach. Ground-based anti-aircraft artillery proved equally impotent. The standard 85 and 100 anti-aircraft guns could not elevate to angles required to engage targets at 70,000 feet, even if projectiles possessed sufficient muzzle velocity to reach those altitudes, which they did not. Soviet commanders faced the humiliating reality that American reconnaissance aircraft operated over their most sensitive military facilities with complete impunity. Premier Khrushchev received briefings about the violations and reacted with characteristic fury, demanding immediate solutions. He personally attended demonstrations of new surface-to-air missile systems under development, pressing engineers and military commanders to accelerate deployment of weapons capable of destroying the American spy planes. The U-2 program expanded rapidly through 1956 and 1957 as CIA planners recognized the extraordinary intelligence value the overflights provided. Missions photographed Soviet bomber bases, revealing that claims about massive strategic aviation forces were exaggerated. U-2 imagery showed far fewer operational bombers than American intelligence had estimated, effectively debunking the bomber gap that had driven defense appropriations through the early 1950s. Additional flights located missile test facilities at Kapustin Yar and Turatam, the latter becoming known as Baikonur Cosmodrome after Soviet space program launches began there. The photography provided comprehensive cataloging of Soviet military infrastructure that informed American strategic planning and arms control negotiation positions. Each successful mission reinforced confidence that altitude provided adequate protection and that Soviet air defenses could not effectively threaten U-2 operations. Premier Khrushchev directed immediate development of countermeasures capable of destroying high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. The solution emerged from Soviet surface-to-air missile programs initiated during the early 1950s. The S-75 Dvina system, designated SA-2 Guideline by NATO, employed radio command guidance directing missiles toward targets tracked by ground-based radar. Development began in 1953 under Chief Designer Pyotr Grushin, responding to requirements for a system capable of engaging high-altitude bomber formations. The initial S-75 variant employed two-stage solid propellant missiles that achieved maximum engagement altitude near 60,000 feet, adequate for engaging conventional bombers but insufficient against U-2 reconnaissance aircraft. Grushin's design bureau initiated urgent development of improved variants incorporating larger rocket motors, refined aerodynamics, and enhanced guidance algorithms to extend performance envelope. The improved missiles employed larger solid rocket boosters that accelerated the weapon to supersonic speed before second-stage liquid propellant sustainer motors ignited. The second stage burned unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine fuel with inhibited red fuming nitric acid oxidizer, generating thrust that propelled the missile to maximum velocity exceeding Mach 3.5. The SA-2 system achieved initial operational capability in 1957. Soviet air defense forces began deploying battalions around Moscow and other strategic facilities throughout 1957 and 1958. Each battalion comprised 6 missile launchers positioned in a characteristic hexagonal pattern around a central fire control radar designated Fan Song by NATO. The Fan Song radar simultaneously tracked targets and guided missiles through radio command links, transmitting steering corrections that directed weapons toward intercept points. The system's maximum engagement altitude was officially rated at 60,000 feet for the initial production variant, but Soviet engineers continuously refined performance. Improved missiles designated V-750VN entered production in 1959, incorporating modifications that extended theoretical maximum altitude to approximately 70,000 feet under favorable conditions. The modifications included redesigned sustainer motor with higher specific impulse, improved control surfaces with greater effectiveness at high altitude where air density was minimal, an enhanced guidance receiver with better sensitivity to command signals. CIA technical intelligence monitored Soviet air defense developments through signals intelligence collection and debriefings of sources with access to military information. Intelligence analysts recognized that SA-2 improvements threatened U-2 operations, but assessments differed regarding the severity of the threat. Some analysts argued that even improved SA-2 missiles could not reliably engage aircraft at 70,000 feet. The missiles would be operating at the extreme edge of their performance envelope where small variations in atmospheric conditions, missile performance, or target altitude could determine success or failure. Lockheed engineers calculated that U-2s operating at 72,000 feet maintained margins of approximately 5,000 feet above maximum SA-2 intercept altitude under standard conditions. Other analysts were less optimistic, noting that Soviet engineers might achieve better performance than technical assessments predicted, and that operational factors including launch geometry and target trajectory could significantly affect intercept probability. President Eisenhower personally reviewed intelligence assessments and risk analyses before authorizing each U-2 overflight. By 1959, Eisenhower had grown increasingly concerned about the political consequences if an aircraft was lost over Soviet territory. He directed that U-2 missions should be restricted to highest priority intelligence requirements that could not be satisfied through alternative means. The developing Corona satellite reconnaissance program promised to provide overhead imagery without risking pilots or diplomatic incidents, but the satellites remained experimental through late 1959 with multiple launch failures. Until satellites achieved reliable operational capability, the U-2 remained the only system capable of providing high-resolution imagery of Soviet strategic forces. Eisenhower approved missions sparingly, often rejecting CIA requests for overflights that he judged insufficiently important to justify the risk. By early 1960, tensions between the superpowers showed signs of easing. Khrushchev had visited the United States in September 1959, meeting with Eisenhower at Camp David in discussions that both leaders characterized as constructive. Plans progressed for a Paris summit scheduled for May 16, 1960, where Eisenhower and Khrushchev would discuss arms control measures and potential reductions in Cold War tensions. Eisenhower directed that U-2 overflights should cease before the summit to avoid any incident that might jeopardize the negotiations. The CIA requested authorization for one final mission targeting Soviet ICBM facilities at Plesetsk and submarine bases at Severodvinsk, installations that satellite reconnaissance could not yet adequately monitor. Agency officials argued that intelligence about Soviet strategic forces was essential for informed negotiations at the summit. Eisenhower reluctantly approved Operation Grand Slam with explicit direction that it must be completed no later than May 1, providing 2 weeks buffer before the summit. Francis Gary Powers received the mission assignment on April 28. Powers was born in Jenkins, Kentucky on August 17, 1929. He graduated from Milligan College in Tennessee with a degree in economics before joining the Air Force in 1950. Powers completed pilot training and flew Thunderjet fighter bombers with tactical units before CIA recruiters approached him in 1956 about a classified special duty assignment involving high-altitude flight. Powers joined the U-2 program in May 1956, completing initial training at Groom Lake before deploying to Detachment B at Incirlik Air Base in Turkey. He flew his first operational overflight in 1956 and accumulated 27 missions over the following 4 years. Powers was a methodical, cautious pilot who followed procedures precisely and avoided unnecessary risks. His performance evaluations described him as technically proficient, though not the most aggressive or innovative pilot in the program. For Operation Grand Slam, Powers would fly Article 360, a U-2C variant incorporating refined aerodynamic features, an improved J-57P-37A engine that provided slightly better altitude performance than earlier models. Powers departed Incirlik for the staging base at Peshawar, Pakistan on April 27, positioning for the early morning launch. The mission profile required takeoff at dawn to provide optimal lighting conditions over target areas during midday while landing in Norway during afternoon hours. Powers conducted standard pre-flight procedures on May 1, checking pressure suit functionality, oxygen system operation, navigation equipment calibration, and camera system status. The reconnaissance payload included Type B camera with 36-inch focal length lens capable of resolving objects smaller than 3 feet across from maximum altitude. The camera exposed film continuously during the overflight, capturing swaths of imagery approximately 125 miles wide along the flight path. Ground crews loaded the camera magazines with 10,500 feet of 70mm film providing coverage for the entire mission. Powers lifted off at 6:20 local time, climbing on a northwesterly heading toward the Afghan border. The ascent to cruise altitude consumed approximately 1 hour as the heavily loaded aircraft climbed gradually in the thin air at high altitude where rate of climb decreased to less than 500 feet per minute. By 7:30, Powers reached 68,000 feet and crossed into Soviet airspace near the Afghan-Soviet border. He activated the camera system and settled into the mission routine that would occupy him for the next 4 hours, monitoring fuel consumption and engine parameters, checking navigation fixes against planned route, maintaining precise altitude and airspeed within the narrow coffin corner margins. The autopilot maintained heading and altitude once engaged, but pilots made frequent manual corrections to compensate for winds and ensure accurate navigation along the planned route. Soviet air defense radar operators detected Powers U-2 immediately after it crossed the border. The National Air Defense Forces Command Center in Moscow received reports of an unidentified high-altitude target proceeding northward through Soviet Central Asia. Air defense commanders activated alert procedures, scrambling interceptor aircraft from bases along the projected track while ordering SA-2 battalions to prepare for engagement. Multiple MiG-19 fighters launched from bases at Tashkent and other locations, climbing to maximum altitude in futile attempts to reach the intruder. The fighters achieved visual contact, with pilots reporting the distinctive black aircraft clearly visible against the bright sky, but none could climb within weapons range. Soviet ground controllers ordered the interceptors to attempt ramming attacks, suicidal tactics that some pilots during World War II had employed against German bombers. The MiG pilots recognized that at maximum altitude their aircraft lacked sufficient control authority to execute deliberate ramming maneuvers. The fighters stalled before reaching the U-2's flight level. As Powers approached the Ural Mountains region, Soviet air defense commanders identified optimal intercept opportunities. Multiple SA-2 battalions defended military and industrial facilities throughout the Urals, and Powers' planned route would bring him within range of several sites. Major Mikhail Voronov commanded Battery 57 of the 4th Battalion stationed near Sverdlovsk. Voronov received engagement authorization from Regional Air Defense Headquarters as the target entered his battalion's coverage area. The Fansong fire control radar achieved solid track on the U-2 at 8:45 hours Moscow time. Voronov initiated firing sequence, launching 3 missiles in rapid succession over an 11-minute period. Soviet doctrine called for multiple missiles to ensure successful engagement, compensating for individual weapon reliability issues and improving probability of intercept. At 8:53 hours Moscow time, Powers flew directly over Sverdlovsk at 70,500 feet altitude, approximately 4 hours into his mission. He maintained heading 315 degrees at indicated airspeed 202 knots, the precisely calculated velocity that balanced maximum speed against stall speed at current weight and altitude. Fuel consumption had decreased gross weight to approximately 14,000 pounds, and Powers monitored remaining fuel against planned route to ensure sufficient reserves for reaching Norway. Without warning, Powers observed a missile contrail rising from the ground approximately 2 miles ahead and slightly left of his position. The contrail marked the trajectory of Voronov's first missile, climbing toward intercept. Standard evasion procedures specified immediate descending turn away from the threat, but U-2 pilots understood that aggressive maneuvering at maximum altitude risked aerodynamic stall or structural failure. Powers had only seconds to react. He initiated a gentle turn while watching the missile approach. The SA-2 employed proximity fuse that detonated the 200-kilogram high-explosive fragmentation warhead when radar sensors detected target presence within lethal radius. The missile passed approximately 20 meters behind and below Powers' aircraft. The proximity fuse activated, and the warhead detonated at 8:53 hours and 14 seconds. The expanding sphere of steel fragments traveling at velocities exceeding 5,000 feet per second shredded the U-2's empennage. Fragments punctured the pressure vessel maintaining cockpit environment, causing explosive decompression. Additional fragments severed control linkages connecting cockpit controls to elevator and rudder surfaces. Powers felt the aircraft lurch violently as aerodynamic forces acting on the damaged tail structure pitched the nose up. Within 2 seconds, the U-2 was inverted, entering an uncontrolled tumble as the disabled flight controls prevented pilot input from affecting the aircraft's motion. Powers found himself pinned against his seat, restraints by g-forces exceeding 6 times normal gravity as the aircraft gyrated through multiple axes. The centrifugal forces prevented him from moving his arms to reach critical switches and controls. He attempted unsuccessfully to activate the aircraft destruct mechanism, a small explosive charge designed to destroy sensitive reconnaissance equipment and cameras to prevent recovery by adversary forces. The destruct switches were located on the instrument panel, but the violent motion and extreme g-forces made reaching them impossible. Powers realized the aircraft was tumbling uncontrollably at high speed, and that remaining with it would result in certain death. Standard procedures called for ejecting using the ejection seat, but pilots had been briefed that ejection at high altitude might result in parachute deployment at altitudes where oxygen deprivation would cause death before descent to breathable atmosphere. At approximately 30,000 feet, after falling more than 40,000 feet in an uncontrolled tumble, decreasing aerodynamic loads allowed Powers to release his seat restraints. The canopy had already separated during the tumbling descent. Powers separated from the disintegrating aircraft manually rather than using the ejection seat. His parachute deployed automatically through a barometric sensor at 15,000 feet, arresting his descent with severe opening shock that stunned him momentarily. Powers floated toward Earth in the bright morning sunlight, fully conscious and aware that he was descending into Soviet territory where capture was certain. He saw wreckage from his aircraft scattered across the ground below, the distinctive long wings separated from the fuselage, the tail section completely destroyed, debris spread over several kilometers. He considered using the silver dollar concealed in his survival kit. The coin contained a poison needle providing means for suicide if capture and torture appeared inevitable. He decided against it, calculating that the Soviets might treat him as a military prisoner rather than execute him immediately. Powers landed in a field approximately 30 miles southeast of Sverdlovsk city center. Local collective farm workers witnessed his descent and approached cautiously. Powers raised his hands in surrender as armed police and military personnel arrived within minutes. They confiscated his survival kit, pressure suit, personal effects, and parachute before transporting him by vehicle to Sverdlovsk NKVD headquarters. The KGB took custody within 3 hours, beginning interrogation that would continue intermittently for the next 2 weeks. Meanwhile, Soviet military and security forces converged on the crash site, recovering substantial wreckage including the camera systems with exposed film showing Soviet military installations, navigation equipment with classified avionics, and Powers' pressure suit with CIA identification documents. The recovery provided Soviet intelligence with comprehensive information about American reconnaissance capabilities, sensor technologies, flight profiles, and operational procedures. The American government received no information about Powers' fate for several days. CIA operations officers monitoring the mission became concerned when Article 360 failed to report position at scheduled navigation checkpoints. When the aircraft did not arrive at Bodo Air Station at the planned time and no emergency radio transmissions were received, operations staff presumed the aircraft had crashed due to mechanical failure. The standard presumption for missing U-2 flights was catastrophic structural or engine failure resulting in total destruction of the aircraft and death of the pilot. The CIA activated predetermined cover story procedures. On May 3, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration issued a press release describing the loss of a high-altitude weather research aircraft that had departed from Incirlik Air Base in Turkey on a routine atmospheric sampling mission. The NASA statement explained that the pilot reported oxygen system difficulties before radio contact was lost, and that the aircraft presumably crashed after the pilot became incapacitated. The cover story presumed complete destruction of the aircraft and death of the pilot, eliminating any possibility that sensitive equipment or personnel might be captured intact. On May 5, Premier Khrushchev addressed the Supreme Soviet and announced that Soviet air defense forces had shot down an American military aircraft violating Soviet airspace on May 1. Khrushchev withheld information about Powers' survival and the extensive wreckage recovery, allowing American officials to continue promoting the weather research cover story while Soviet intelligence assessed the propaganda value of revealing the full truth. The tactical silence lasted only 2 days. President Eisenhower, unaware that Powers had survived and that physical evidence of espionage operations had been recovered intact, authorized the State Department to reiterate the NASA cover story. Secretary of State Christian Herter issued statements on May 6 insisting that no deliberate violation of Soviet airspace had occurred, and that any penetration resulted from navigational error after the pilot experienced oxygen system failure rendering him unconscious. On May 7, Khrushchev revealed the truth in a dramatic announcement to the Supreme Soviet. He described in detail that the pilot had been captured alive and had confessed to conducting espionage missions over Soviet territory. Khrushchev read excerpts from Power's interrogation statements describing his CIA employment, training at secret facilities in the United States, previous reconnaissance missions, and the specific intelligence objectives for the May 1 overflight. Soviet authorities arranged a press conference where Powers, wearing civilian clothing provided by his captors, acknowledged his mission and described his CIA employment. The televised confession broadcast internationally demolished American cover stories and exposed the U-2 program to worldwide scrutiny. The public humiliation was complete. Not only had Soviet air defenses destroyed an American spy plane, but the pilot survived to provide detailed confession of espionage operations that American officials had just denied with blatant lies. The diplomatic catastrophe unfolded rapidly. Eisenhower faced impossible choices: continue denying obvious truth in face of physical evidence and pilot confession, or admit that the United States had conducted deliberate espionage flights over Soviet territory for 4 years while lying about weather research. Eisenhower chose to acknowledge the overflights, arguing that Soviet secrecy about military capabilities necessitated extraordinary intelligence collection measures. The admission represented unprecedented acknowledgement by an American president that the United States engaged in peacetime espionage operations. Khrushchev demanded formal apology, pledged to end reconnaissance flights, and punishment of officials responsible for authorizing illegal violations of Soviet sovereignty. Eisenhower refused to apologize, maintaining that Soviet military secrecy justified American intelligence operations. The Paris summit collapsed before substantive negotiations began. Khrushchev arrived in Paris on May 15 and immediately issued ultimatum demanding American apology as precondition for participating in the summit. Eisenhower refused. On May 16, during preliminary meetings before the formal summit opening, Khrushchev delivered vitriolic denunciation of American aggression and walked out, declaring he would not negotiate with a government that conducted illegal espionage while lying about its actions. The summit ended without any discussions of the substantive issues it had been intended to address. The U-2 incident destroyed whatever progress toward detente had been achieved through Khrushchev's 1959 visit to the United States and the Camp David discussions. The Cold War entered a new period of heightened tensions that would culminate 2 years later in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet authorities staged an elaborate show trial beginning August 17, 1960 in Moscow's Hall of Columns, the same venue where Stalin's purge trials had occurred during the 1930s. Francis Gary Powers faced charges of espionage under Article 2 of the Soviet Criminal Code, which carried potential death penalty. The prosecution presented overwhelming physical evidence, including cameras recovered from the crash site, rolls of exposed film showing Soviet military facilities, maps marked with reconnaissance targets and flight routes, survival kit containing American currency and gold coins, and the infamous silver dollar with concealed poison needle. Soviet prosecutors emphasized the poison device as evidence of American perfidy and intent to avoid capture through suicide rather than face justice. Powers testified about his recruitment in 1956, training at classified facilities, deployment to Turkey, and 27 previous reconnaissance missions over Soviet territory and other countries. His testimony provided details about CIA operations, payment arrangements, cover stories, and procedures that had remained closely guarded secrets. The trial's outcome was predetermined, but the Soviet government used the proceedings for maximum propaganda effect. Foreign journalists attended selected sessions, and Soviet media provided extensive coverage emphasizing American aggression and espionage. Powers' court-appointed defense attorney argued that Powers had followed orders from his government and should be treated as military serviceman rather than criminal spy. The attorney noted that Powers made no attempt to use the poison device, chose to preserve his life rather than destroy himself, and cooperated fully with Soviet authorities. The arguments had no effect on verdict. The Soviet court convicted Powers on August 19, sentencing him to 10 years confinement, 3 years in prison followed by 7 years hard labor. The sentence was less severe than the death penalty the prosecution had requested, reflecting Soviet calculation that keeping Powers alive served propaganda purposes better than execution would. Powers began serving his sentence at Vladimir Central Prison, a facility approximately 180 kilometers east of Moscow that housed political prisoners and foreigners convicted of espionage. Conditions were harsh but not deliberately brutal. Powers shared a cell with another prisoner, received adequate food, and had limited access to reading material. The Soviet government ensured he remained healthy as potential asset for future prisoner exchange. American officials, including Powers' wife Barbara, advocated publicly for his release, arguing that he was a military serviceman who should be accorded prisoner of war status rather than treated as criminal. The CIA maintained contact with Powers' family and provided financial support while conducting damage assessment to determine what intelligence compromises resulted from his capture and confession. On February 10, 1962, after 21 months' imprisonment, Powers walked across Glienicke Bridge connecting West Berlin with Potsdam in East Germany. The exchange involved Soviet KGB Colonel Rudolf Abel, who had been arrested by the FBI in 1957 and convicted of espionage against the United States. The simultaneous exchange occurred at 8:20 hours Berlin time, with officials from both countries monitoring carefully to ensure neither side violated agreed procedures. Powers crossed into West Berlin where American officials conducted immediate medical examination and began extensive debriefings. The CIA questioned Powers for weeks, documenting details of his interrogation, identifying what information he had provided to Soviet authorities, and assessing what damage resulted. The agency concluded that Powers had resisted effectively, providing only information that Soviets could derive independently from examining recovered aircraft wreckage, while protecting sensitive intelligence sources and operational details. Despite CIA assessment that Powers had performed appropriately under extraordinarily difficult circumstances, public opinion in the United States remained divided. Some viewed Powers as a hero who survived impossible situation and returned home to face unjust criticism. Others argued he should have used the suicide option to prevent Soviet propaganda exploitation or that he had cooperated too readily with his captors. Congressional hearings in March 1962 allowed Powers to provide public testimony about the incident. He described the shootdown, his capture, interrogation procedures, prison conditions, and his decision-making throughout the ordeal. The testimony revealed classified details about U-2 operations and CIA procedures, generating controversy about whether such information should be publicly disclosed. The hearings concluded that Powers had acted appropriately, but the shadow over his reputation never entirely lifted. The technical analysis of the shootdown revealed multiple factors that combined to enable successful engagement. Powers flew a predictable track at constant altitude and speed, providing SA fire control systems optimal targeting solution. The atmospheric conditions on May 1 featured temperature inversion that marginally extended missile performance by reducing air density at altitudes where aerodynamic drag became limiting factor. The engagement geometry was nearly ideal. Powers approached Voronov's battery on heading that placed the target within optimal firing parameters for maximum kinetic energy at intercept. Most significantly, Soviet intelligence had excellent information about U-2 flight patterns from monitoring previous missions. The Soviets positioned additional SA-2 battalions along routes that U-2 flights had historically followed, creating layered defense that increased probability of successful engagement. The combination of favorable tactical geometry, optimized missile performance, and Powers' failure to execute immediate evasive maneuvers when he detected the launch created conditions allowing the SA-2 to reach the U-2 despite operating at extreme edge of performance envelope. The loss of Article 360 immediately terminated CIA U-2 operations over Soviet territory. Eisenhower personally ordered that no additional overflights would occur, acknowledging that Soviet air defenses posed unacceptable risks. The U-2 remained operational for missions over areas where Soviet weapons did not threaten it, Cuba, China, Southeast Asia, and other regions. But the era of deep penetration overflights into the heart of Soviet territory ended on May 1, 1960. The intelligence gap required alternative solutions. The Corona satellite program, which had experienced multiple failures during 1959, finally achieved successful film recovery in August 1960. The satellite imagery demonstrated that orbital reconnaissance could provide coverage comparable to U-2 photography without risking pilots or creating diplomatic incidents. Satellite systems became primary method for overhead reconnaissance of Soviet territory, relegating U-2 to missions in areas where satellite coverage was insufficient or where aircraft flexibility provided advantages. The shootdown accelerated development of successor reconnaissance systems designed to survive advanced air defenses. Lockheed Skunk Works initiated Project Oxguard in the late 1950s, developing the A-12 reconnaissance aircraft that employed speed and altitude as layered defenses. The A-12 cruised at Mach 3.2 and 85,000 feet, performance that allowed outrunning missiles rather than relying solely on altitude for protection. The Air Force's SR-71 Blackbird, derived from the A-12, became operational in 1966 and served until 1998. The SR-71 flew more than 3,500 missions and faced over 4,000 missile launches without suffering a single combat loss. The speed-based defense proved more durable than altitude alone. Francis Gary Powers returned to private life after his CIA debriefings concluded. He worked as test pilot for Lockheed, conducting flight tests on U-2 aircraft that continued serving with Air Force and CIA units. In 1970, Powers published his memoir Operation Overflight, providing detailed account of the incident and his imprisonment. The book revealed previously classified information about U-2 operations and sparked controversy about whether former intelligence personnel should publish such material. Powers later worked as traffic helicopter pilot for Los Angeles television station KNBC. On August 1, 1977, the helicopter he was piloting crashed in Encino, California after running out of fuel. Powers and his cameraman died in the crash. He was 47 years old. In 2000, the CIA posthumously awarded Powers the Director's Medal and other decorations recognizing his service and acknowledging that criticism he faced after returning from Soviet imprisonment was unwarranted. The confidence that CIA planners invested in altitude as absolute defense collapsed when Major Voronov's SA-2 battery demonstrated that Soviet missiles could reach heights previously considered sanctuary. The presumption that the U-2's performance margins provided sufficient safety evaporated when Powers' aircraft fell from 70,500 feet trailing smoke and debris. The diplomatic disaster that followed from believing the cover story would hold despite Powers' survival, and the aircraft's recovery exposed dangers of operational plans that presumed best-case outcomes. Operation Grand Slam proved that even the most sophisticated technology operated by highly trained personnel becomes vulnerable when adversaries possess determination and capability to develop effective countermeasures. The U-2 that climbed toward the dawn on May 1, 1960, carried not just cameras and fuel, but also the hubris that altitude alone could guarantee survival. When SA-2 fragments tore through its tail section at 70,500 feet, they destroyed more than an aircraft. They shattered the illusion that American technology had created a spy plane beyond Soviet reach. The lesson that emerged from the wreckage scattered across the Urals remained clear. No technological advantage lasts forever, and the presumption of invulnerability represents the most dangerous assumption in strategic competition.